This video is about the prenuptial agreements, and I'm a lawyer for 40 years in Ontario. I'm also called to the bar in England and also to the bar in India, and I want to give my perspective of the need for prenuptial agreements in the province of Ontario based on the culture and society here. And to discuss that issue with me today, we have Roshni, who has written an article and published it also on the question of what is called prenuptial agreement, which in the Ontario law, in the Family Law Act, is called the cohabitation agreement. So Roshni, I'm glad you're here today, and I want to hear your questions and give you my answers to the questions that you have.
Okay, well, I think the first question that I'm sure everyone's curious as to the answer, what exactly is a prenuptial agreement?
Prenuptial, as the word suggests, is an agreement that two persons marrying decide as to what they should say by virtue of a contract as to their obligations during marriage. The prenuptial agreement is not a legal word in Ontario. It is in fact legally called cohabitation agreement, which is an agreement permitted in the last about 25 plus years as an agreement permissible in the law to bind the parties in marriage, which was not there in the common law, which came from England. The tradition was that you could not make an agreement, which law was fundamentally changed in Ontario by virtue of making it possible for the parties intending to marry, or even if they are married, to have an agreement which is binding between them.
Well, as you're aware, Canada is a very multicultural society, and prenups can have a different meaning in different cultures. With respect to marriage, in the event of a breakdown, is it similar in terms of its impact from culture to culture?
No, I believe it is very different. To just illustrate this from the Muslim law point of view, in the Muslim culture there is an agreement that is made, which is given by gold coins and this arrangement under which there is a relationship of or understanding, if you like, by an agreement, what happens in the event of divorce. So those who come from that culture have a different tradition even when they come to Canada, because the cultural attitudes do not change overnight because they change the country of residence. And therefore you will see that the divorce rates and the need for how the parties conduct themselves in the event of a marriage and divorce is based on the ethnic groups that you deal with, actually, which traditions change over time, but the statistics in those different groups are different. So some groups will react differently to the agreement, other groups will not, but the overall statistics indicate in Ontario and Canada that the divorce rates are very high, and therefore my view is that in general, for all different groups residing in Canada and who consider Canada as their domicile and their jurisdiction where they live and which law applies to them, it is in my view a helpful document to have.
All right, well, keeping that in mind, I think we can all agree that most people enter marriage not anticipating or hoping for a divorce. So with respect to a prenuptial agreement, in the event that a marriage does break down, what exactly does a prenuptial agreement address?
It can address all issues of marriage, first of all, such as what religion, if they will follow, what properties they will have, which is the house they will designate as a principal residence or matrimonial home in the language of the law, and other issues that affect the life of the family. But it also can deal with the question of divorce in the event that the parties separated. So it does address that issue, which is what is helpful in the event that the marriage breakdown takes place.
Okay, well, with respect, we all know prenuptial agreements are aimed to protect one's assets. With respect to family assets, can you elaborate on this concept of net family property? Is this division of a 50-50 a fixed rule or not a fixed rule?
The rule has been fixed in the concept of the net family property, which is prescribed in the Family Law Act of Ontario, which has been amended a number of times in the last 20 years. but essentially it is the concept of what you bring into the marriage at the commencement of the marriage and how you will divide these assets accumulated during marriage equally, particularly the matrimonial home. So there is this formula of the 50-50 division which is to be observed in the law should the separation take place.
All right, I think this is a very important question and one I'd like to know more about. If you're in a marriage without a prenuptial agreement versus a marriage with a prenuptial agreement, can you maybe explain what the major differences will be in the event of a breakdown?
I think what the prenuptial agreement does is to give more written and documented relationship between the parties which they have thought out and then agreed upon. They've also agreed upon what the provisions will be in the event of separation. And therefore, I think that the risk of spending a lot of money on the legal system to try to resolve your differences should one have a separation is minimized but not eliminated actually. So the advantage of the prenuptial agreement is that it deals with the separation, it deals with the marriage, and attempts to bring a defined, custom-made relationship in the relationship of a man and a woman. Usually, it's now changed, though that part has changed as well. But I think it helps to clarify in view of the fact that the society and the attitudes to marriage are changing so dramatically in Canada.
Right, and I think you're very correct in terms of the attitude change. But you touched upon the concept of fees and it being a very expensive process to go through a divorce. Why is litigation so expensive in family law cases?
Well, put it very simply, actually, I think the lawyers have priced themselves out of the market of the legal system for the average middle-class person in Canada. In translating that into the question of how to deal with the separation, which happens almost to 45% of the population in Canada, the problem is that the lawyers on average are charging $250 to $300 an hour. So every issue that you deal with in separation has to be dealt with at that expense level per hour. And when the emotions are high and the custody and the separation issues have to be decided on and the parties cannot even talk to each other, they're spending that money on each lawyer who in turn is talking to the other lawyer, who in turn is talking to their own respective clients, and the adversarial system creates a conflict which is expensive and ends up being about $5,000 to $30,000 range for each divorce that happens, which then makes the public feel actually that why are the lawyers charging so much? But the lawyers are going through 10 years of training to be lawyers, and they're saying we're similar to doctors and we should be paid for the time we spend. And the adversarial system in which we ask the problem to be resolved creates this problem of dealing with the opposing party when the marriage breaks down, the expense which I think personally should be avoided if possible through mediation or an agreement of the type that I'm suggesting, which is the prenuptial agreement.
Right, and you know, coming back to fees, because you know the reality is it's a very expensive process, and a lot of people are concerned about this. If one is trying to be proactive and try to protect themselves, and I come to you saying I'd like a prenuptial agreement, how much is this going to cost me?
It would cost about, I would say on average, $1,500 to $3,000 actually. You know, I think that's the first meeting, understanding the history of the relationship, how far the parties are willing or are negotiating, and you have to prepare the other party to go to another lawyer. It's called independent legal advice. And all that put together, on average, costs about $1,500 to $3,000. It can cost more, and if you try to use standardized forms, which are not a good thing to do, it can cost a little less. But I think you still should have a lawyer involved to make sure that this agreement is done properly. That's the average cost.
Okay, and just to conclude, what's your take in terms of prenuptial agreements going forward? As you mentioned, attitudes are changing. Where do you see prenuptial agreements in 10 years from now?
I think that in the last 25 years, what I watched in my 40 years of practice is that the attitudes are changing. And they're definitely changing in favor of having an agreement. Where do I stand in this regard? Actually, I would recommend an agreement for somebody getting married in Canada. So I think that the saying goes, if you love somebody, should you simply say it verbally, I personally think as a lawyer, actually, you should say it in writing, in an agreement. Here is what I want to do, and therefore can be put in writing. I think it's a good thing to do. Thank you, Roshni, and thank you, and my name is Jay Chauhan. I'm on the website jchauhan.ca.